share your screen right now. Okay. All right. And so Dr. Masani has her PhD in genetics from Michigan State University. And I'm very excited to invite Shahnaz to come be our keynote speaker because Dr. Masani's research is on how to use critical frameworks to help support students in um, developing a critical consciousness around science teaching and learning. And as person who is right, her PhD is in genetics, her expertise is immunology, is maybe a little outside of our community. However, like many of us, Dr. Masani teaches introductory biology, right? And so she is teaching in ecology, and she is leading students in learning about ecology in the field and in the classroom. And she's bringing her work using critical frameworks to this. And I thought that what she's doing is really a very nice example on an authentic way to bring 4DEE into the social justice for education. So thank you, Shahnaz, and we're very excited to learn from you today.
Thank you all for having me. I'll start by just saying I'm very excited to be here. My master's was in zoology, so it's lovely to kind of be back here. And also I'm really intimidated to be here because there's like so many faces and people that I look up to in this space. So just putting it out there. So I'm less nervous. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my introductory biology classroom, specifically focusing on the organismal biology lab, where I have students going through a course-based undergraduate research experience. And this experience is really designed to build their understanding of the historical contexts of inequities and really to connect their understandings of historical contexts, human health, and ecosystems. And so before I begin kind of talking about any other work, I just wanted to put out there that this isn't really my work. I'm just the one presenting it here. It's really a true collaboration with me and two of my wonderful colleagues at MSU, Nilofer Akalin and Kriya Velasco. Both of whom are social scientists and humanities scholars, and have really helped me build that critical lens and think through how to truly engage students in thinking about science and its intersections with history and society. And to make the point that I truly believe my most powerful work comes from these spaces where I really push myself to work with folks outside my discipline with different disciplinary expertise and different lived experiences. And so today we're going to focus on three main aspects. We're going to start with the what. So what's the main learning outcome that I want for my students? I'll then give you some context as to the where, right? Giving you a little bit of an introduction to my course and the curriculum. And then I'll spend the most of my time thinking about the how, so really deep diving into different aspects of the curriculum. And so as we start with the what of the learning outcome, I have one simple major learning outcome in mind. I want my students to design and implement ecological research projects that trace the historical origins of inequities in both human health and ecosystems. And I want them to do this in a place-based way, so within their local communities. And because this is a fairly large and sometimes ambiguous sounding sentence, I thought I'd just start by giving you an example. So this is one example of a student project over the semester. Their specific research question asks, how and why do redlined and non-redlined areas differ in both the bacterial and the fungal species diversity? And with the rates of respiratory illnesses. So they're really making this multi-layered historical, social, ecological connection. What you see here is the end product. At the end of the semester, they have come up with this map that gives you the historical context. And then the little graphs that you see over to the side, that is the new ecological knowledge. So that is experimental evidence that they are adding that did not exist before for their question. And so as I think about this project within the context of the 4DEE framework, I might start by thinking through, was I think about core ecological concepts. This group specifically is drawing on concepts of community ecology, species diversity, biodiversity. They're engaging in those core practices of ecology, right? They're performing fieldwork, they're designing and critiquing investigations. And then as I think through the human environment interactions, they're really thinking deeply about urban ecology, right? And situating all of their work within a framework of environmental justice. And I'll spend just a little bit more time kind of thinking through what environmental justice looks like within my class. So as I think about environmental justice, what I want for my students is for them to be able to envision ecology as a path to social justice. And what I mean by that is I really want to engage students in authentic inquiry, right? So asking questions that are unanswered or poorly answered, really getting them to grapple with, all right, how can I use ecology to add new knowledge, but not just any new knowledge that will truly challenge deep-seated inequities in our society. And so as I worked with my two colleagues to really trouble how we do this, we identified that what was important in our mind was to build their ecological knowledge within the structured social and historical context. And so to kind of put this really simply, right, what I had noticed was that my students often saw the relevance and the importance of engaging in science and thinking through society and societal structures and engaging with community and thinking deeply about their identities. But they saw all of these things as important, but separate in their lives, right? And what I really wanted them to do was to think about those wonderful intersections and the way that thinking intersectionally can strengthen our scientific approach. And as I started thinking about, well, why aren't they thinking intersectionally? I realized that it's because that's not the way my teaching was structured, right? If I teach in silos, they will learn in silos. And so as I think about bringing these intersections, really making them visible in the classroom, I focus on two main aspects. So I think about having students build their structural lens. So asking all of those how questions. How is society structured? How are groups different? How are ecologies different? And then pushing beyond the how or the current to the why, right? So really thinking historically about why is society structured along those lines? Why do these differences in ecology exist? Why do these inequities persist? And so as I think through the where, right? Here's a little bit of a very quick introduction to my course. As I mentioned, it's an introductory biology lab course. It's a cure. I have mostly first and second year undergraduate students. We have 18 to 24 sections in a lab. The teaching team consists of me and two undergraduate learning assistants, and students work in groups of 3 to 4 to design and conduct independent research projects. The way that the semester breaks down is the first 4 weeks, we give them an intensive introductory case study. And so we're really modeling, scaffolding the ways that I want them to be applying and integrating their knowledge. And so we use a case study of Richmond, where we really ask questions about how urban heat islands and plant biodiversity impacts racial disparities in asthma. And we have two main focuses within this case study. One is the intro to mapping systemic inequities, right? So building that structural, societal, historical lens. And then the other main focus is to build their science process and ecological field techniques. So really building those core concepts and practices. And then once we've done the case study, once we've scaffolded that learning, we ask them to apply their learning. Again, it maps pretty directly. Ask your own question, but now still build an inequities map and use your ecological concepts and practices to add new information. As we think through the design and implementation of the projects, it also happens in a scaffolded manner with first a focus on planning and then implementation. And so as we dig deeper into the curriculum, I'm going to give you a little bit of a deep dive into that introductory case study. That's where we'll spend most of our time. And then we'll quickly look over research planning and revisit the outcomes at the end. So as I think through the Richmond case study, it's a multi-part case study, lasts about 3 or 4 weeks. And we start by just introducing them to an overarching question or a real world problem. And then we're going to revisit the problem, adding context and detail across the several weeks. What you'll also see is as we revisit the case study, each week intentionally looks a little bit at the societal historical structures, and then also has a part that really builds that ecological knowledge. That is intentional. I do not want them to see these things as first we do this, then we do that separately, but rather integrating those pieces together. And so as I think about the introduction, here is their introductory context, right? It's really simple. It introduces to them, as you see in bold, it talks about the Gilpin neighborhood in Richmond, and it talks about temperature differences. So Gilpin is 15 degrees higher than wealthier, wider parts of town. So it immediately connects the ecology to both socioeconomic status and race, right? So intersecting and introducing ecological inequities. And then further, it connects these ecological inequities to health outcomes. So to things like cardiac arrest, respiratory diseases, and so on. And we start by asking students very simply to activate their prior knowledge, right? We know that our students don't come in as blank slates. They have deep understandings and experiences with the world. And so we ask them, okay, explain to me why you see these differences. And as I think about engaging students in these conversations, one of the things that we do is really work together as a teaching team to think about how we elicit the conversations that we want. So as one example of a strategy, I will always tell my ULAs what I want them to do and what the main focus is on. And so here we think about, okay, your job today is to really elicit and build ideas. This is pretty much the ULA's job and my job every single day. But it's a little note card that they have with them, right? To remind them, I restate what a student said, I affirm their contribution, and then I ask why, I build on their ideas. They're also given, besides the deep dive teaching team instruction, they're given quick questions to remind them what the main focus of that day is. So this day's focus is asking the whys. Why are wealthier areas wider? Why did the world end up this way? Why are some areas poor or rich? Really asking those why questions. And as we do this, we see that our students do indeed come in with multi-layered, deep, rich ideas about the world, right? You see here students are thinking about maybe bodies of water are different. Maybe there are less trees in non-wealthy neighborhoods. Maybe there's more cement that absorbs more heat. Maybe there's less access to AC. Maybe there's less access to healthcare. So we're not building from scratch. Our students are coming with a lot that we can build on, right? And we use these prior conceptions to build and to add context. So the next thing we might do is do a jigsaw style reading on systemic racism and ecology. So now taking their concepts and adding maybe formalized terms, like what does canopy cover mean? What does urban heat islands mean? So really adding some of that context. Next, what we start doing is start asking the why, the historical questions. You have a lot of deep understanding about what the world looks like currently. Let's now start asking those, how did it come to be that way? That's that sticking point for my students in my context. And so we do this, again, by truly thinking through how to build those maps, right? I could sit there and talk to students about redlining and draw a map for them, but that's only going to go so far, right? I want to build students' knowledge. I want them to engage in inquiry. I want them to build claims based in evidence. I want them to learn essentially how to read their world. And so this is an activity that we do to help them to start that mapping process. Part A, think of it as kind of the bookends, right? So we're going to start with historical practice. What does redlining look like? What does it mean? What can we learn? And then we're going to end with the current. So what are historical lasting legacies on human health and ecology? And so as we look at that top bookend, where did we begin? How did this start? Let's take a deep dive and look at what that activity might look like. And so in this activity, I'm asking students to use this available, publicly free available database to look at redlining zoning decisions. We talk with students about policies being framed as neutral, right? All we're doing is assessing creditworthiness. So outwardly neutral, but with an underlying racial structure. And so as students deep dive into this, they access that website, they access that database. This is what that database looks like. In case you want to play around with it as I'm talking, this is one link that you could use. What this database allows you to do is to look at any city in the US, and as long as the information is available, you can click on actual zones or census tracts, and it will give you a lot of rich information, right? And so we're cueing students as to what information they should look at. We're telling them, well, look at how decisions were made, right? How were neighborhoods assessed for creditworthiness? And then we're cueing them even further, right? Think about the factors that were considered and the language that was used. And they're specifically doing this for Richmond. And I'm going to maybe just pause for a minute in case you want to use that website, and then I'm going to share some student data. So as my students use this website, here's some of the things that they came up with, right? So they share with me, this is a word we searched for, and this is the outcome that we got, right? So they're building their claims from this historical database and evidence. So this student's claim is that creditworthiness was an excuse to redline areas based on other factors such as race. So we're really uncovering those hidden racialized decisions and policies. We also see by using these tools that students are able to think intersectionally, right? So this is a second example of students thinking through these things. So this student thinks about race, they think about socioeconomic status, and they really think deeply about the language that's used, right? So they identify that words like melting pot were used negatively. They identify xenophobia, and they identify this by looking at words like aliens that were used to describe immigrants, right? And so it really helps students develop this deep, rich historical understanding. Once we build that first bookend, we then add the second bookend, right? So again, drawing on a different database to think through, all right? We have the start of the historical policy, but where do we end up currently? So there's lots of databases that we're using to help students build their understanding. Finally, once we build those two bookends, we want them to fill in the middle of the map, right? How do we get from historical policy to current legacies of inequities? And so here we use a concept mapping tool where they're reading through multiple articles, pulling relevant information, and really thinking through the mechanistic connections. Why does one policy cause the next thing and the next thing, ultimately ending up with current inequities? So we revisit the Richmond study across 4 weeks. Ultimately, they come up with these deep intertwined maps. And as they reflect on this activity, here are some of the things that students say, right? It helps them build new connections, right? So they see lots of intersections and connections. Over the weeks, they add boxes, but more importantly, they add connections between the boxes. And it helps them think about previous events and current lasting impacts. As they do this, this is uncomfortable, right? So students recognize that it makes them uncomfortable. They recognize that their own family might say something like redlining just happened to affect people of color, but engaging in this work helps them build that structural lens. They know now that this was not just happenstance. It helps students build new understandings of the connection between science and community, right? So in looking at community engaged, community-led responses, we have students thinking about teamwork and equity and growth and hope through this process. And it creates spaces that are affirming and add the value of students who are already engaged in this work, right? Here's a student who's talking about these are always things that were important to me. And this is the first science class that creates space to think in these ways. In addition to thinking about mapping these systemic inequities, we also want to build those core ecological concepts and practices. And so this is one example of what that might look like, right? So here you see that, all right, we're thinking through Richmond, we're thinking through urban heat islands. We have some information on canopy cover. What else can we add? So here you see students taking their big picture question and breaking it down into a smaller experimental research question. Okay, maybe we can add information on salinity or plant species diversity. And in building these skills, we're introducing them to field sampling and good experimental design and species diversity concepts and data analysis, all of these different things that they're applying through this case study. All right, as I head up to the end of this talk, I'll quickly touch upon how we scaffold the research planning and then end by thinking through just revisiting the outcome. So as we scaffold research planning, I cannot just engage my students, right? And then say like, go do all of this. We know that knowledge transference is hard. And so we scaffold their planning process through multiple parts. We have them do individual and group brainstorming through multiple versions of an annotated bibliography, right? Pick something you're really interested in, you're truly engaged in, either a health factor or an ecological factor, and then we'll build from there. Look up what is known, look up what is unknown. Let's work through this as a conversation with each other. They do this multiple times. They get a lot of formative feedback. What you see here is a chalk drawing of their research plan, right? Really thinking through sampling, thinking through experimental procedures, all of those fun things. Ultimately leading them to that final outcome, right? That final outcome of we do ecological work that is situated in social context. And we ask questions intentionally to make the world better through our work. And so I'll perhaps kind of stop there and leave room for any questions that you have, any conversation that you have, any resources that you'd want to share.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shahnaz. Folks, we have a lot of time, right? And Shahnaz left us a lot of time purposely so we could have this discussion with her and with each other about these ideas. And so I'd just like you to just raise your hand if you want to join the conversation. Feel free to put things in the chat, but I do want to call on you. We'll
Ah,
start us off with Teresa. Yeah, so Teresa asks, in what way, Shanaz, do you see using the Richmond case study to build hope?
that's a really good question. So one of the things that I did not talk about that we do is in part 4, we do a specific deep dive on the response that the city of Richmond has had. We intentionally picked Richmond because they have done a lot of work to undo these inequities, right? And that has involved a lot of community-led work, but in partnership with policy, in partnership with government officials. And we have a lot of articles and a video that talks through all of the ways that the stakeholders engaged with each other, right? And they made these really intentional and powerful decisions. We're going to build parks that connect communities and undo some of the harm that was done when highways were built and they separated communities. We're going to do this in ways that we're going to engage community in this process. So they had a bunch of stakeholder meetings. They decided that people who would build the park would be from the community, and so that would increase local employment. There's like so many layers there. They talk so honestly through worries about gentrification. Um, it's really, really rich and powerful.
So we're getting a lot of questions, but I want to just ask a follow-up about this Richmond case study. But somehow, okay, there. Are there many nonprofits in Richmond that students can see efficacy and funding differences among these different groups?
There are certainly many nonprofits. I don't want to make any statements about efficacy or funding differences because I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that would be interesting, right, to see like
Yeah.
even the legacy of racism, right, in the different nonprofits that are funded
One of
in
my
current.
hopes for future semesters is that students do more of that, also engaging with communities in Lansing
Mhm.
and Greater Lansing. So yes,
Excellent.
absolutely.
Okay, some questions. So can you talk, this is from Joanna Tang, can you talk about your assessments for this course and what activities you did in lecture versus discussion section versus lab versus homework?
Yes. So I would describe my course as hyperstructured but flexible, right? So every lab and lecture has some type of either pre-reading or pre-video and an associated written assessment. There's a lot of formative feedback. And then big assessments, the more summative assessments in lecture would be quizzes, proficiency-based exams. In lab, big assessments would be the research plan, proposal, those types of things. In general, my class is set up to be proficiency-based, so it's a lot of formative feedback, make the edits, make the corrections, come back to me. So it's structured around that general policy.
Excellent, thank
I
you. Okay,
did
another question. Oh,
maybe just want to think through
yeah.
because you brought up feedback. One
Hmm.
of the things that I have thought a lot about is these things are really hard to address and hard to process. And so one of the ways that we do feedback is, it seems so simple and trivial, but Google Docs comments has been invaluable for me, primarily because in processing some of the feedback, I'm pushing students, right? Students might be resistant. They might be saying things like, I don't see color, I don't see race. And so the Google Docs has given that space for both me to respond gently, kindly, but also calling students into seeing the evidence and then to give students the space to kind of reflect. So it's a lot of discussion in person, but also a discussion kind of through these different modes.
That's great. Hold Savannah Swinney, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. She's asking, can you explain how you deal with undergraduate students having different experience levels with conducting research? So she would imagine that some students have more experience in hypothesis testing or data collection than others, and how do you ensure equity in approaching this part of the class?
Yeah, so it's why intentionally we have not just that one introductory activity, right? But 3 or 4, just as we revisit the map 3 or 4 times, we also revisit the scientific process and application and core ecological concepts 3 or 4 times. So a lot of the science process skills like constructing a research question, hypothesis building, hypothesis testing, They are built in. And I tell my students that I'm not making any assumptions. This is structured to get us all to engage in this way, right? I will say that like creating space for these different types of conversations, so like placing the ecology within that social context, it's been really powerful in multiple ways, not just to like stretch students' thinking and understanding, but also to see the different assets and experiences that our diverse students bring in, right? So it's not just your ability to perform stats tests that we value, it's all of these different ways of thinking.
Excellent. Yeah. And so like Teresa says, if anybody has any questions and you'd like to just, ask verbally, please feel free to raise your hand. Ann Bauer asks, do you use any peer review in these sorts of feedback in your formative assessments?
I have used peer review many times in past semesters. I will be honest, I have not used it this semester because I was anxious with the new stream. And so I just wanted tighter control. I could see myself in future semesters slowly easing back and easing back
Could
into
you say what you mean by stream? You said a new stream. Yes.
So I haven't always had students think through systemic inequities and the intersections with ecology in quite these ways, right? As I designed the cure, this really deep integration of social justice and ecology is new for me. And so doing this really new curriculum in the cure is what we would call a new stream. It's a new focus for the cure.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, Ken, I see that you have a comment about you could see perhaps an discussion emerging about the use of pesticides and herbicides on biodiversity in redline versus non-redline communities. Is that something that,
That is already a student project, so well done,
okay,
students.
yeah, right, yeah. And so in your final assessment, could you kind of remind us, or maybe you could show us, now that we've already seen it, right? We could go back to that. I think you had a slide where you kind of zoomed in, and can you kind of show us how like you're really kind of integrating those 4DEE dimensions in that final learning product?
Sure. Maybe actually maybe.
Yeah, I think maybe in the later one you had it like you cut it up.
So let's
Yeah.
kind of revisit this bit. I think maybe this will add more context. Okay. So as we think about human dimension, we're thinking about the first picture here. They're really thinking through social context, right? So this is like one zoomed in part where they're looking at the impacts of redlining, but they're not just giving me generic information, right? Like redlining and denied federal zones and wealth inequities. The boxes that connect to that are the explicit local context, right? So they're telling me what happens in Detroit specifically, the history of redlining and redlining decisions in Detroit, or wealth inequities and so on. And then as they add to that map, like as an integral part of that map, they're building connections with so bacterial and fungal biodiversity, right? And the way that they add to this map, right, is they're drawing on their core concept, biodiversity. They're drawing on the science practices that would be their materials and their methods, their new experiments section, right? So they're talking through, okay, how will we sample? How will we make sure that our samples are representative? How will we make sure that we're replicating? How will we pick zones to test? How will we analyze the data? What concept of species diversity are we using, right? So they're really truly integrating both things in one research project.
Oh, that's wonderful. One question that has come up, Joanna Tang, is, and I think this is actually like, it's a common question for all kind of cure-based introbio labs, where the whole lab is one kind of big chunk, but like, how do you balance getting all the intro ecology material into the curriculum while adding the interdisciplinary lessons?
I think this isn't even a question just for cures, right? This is
Mhm.
just true for any time we try to bring in application or interdisciplinary learning. And I think if I'm being completely honest and blunt, you do cover less things, but the things that you do, you cover them deeply and you shift students' worldview. And so in my view, that is worth it.
Yeah. No, great. Um, so please, people, if people have comments they want to, like make more of a discussion, please raise your hand. Let me know. Miranda Kearney asks, do you provide your students with any other resources to learn about historical context in addition to the mapping tool? I think people are looking for some resources.
Yep. So the 4-week workbook takes them through a bunch of tools. I just explored the one tool with y'all, but there are so many tools. We have free equities, clear calculators, we have access to grocery stores, access to healthcare, we have lots of EPA databases that we look at. And that's a running list. So it's a list that I started, but it's a list that students add to. So they do those annotated bibliographies. They find resources that I've never heard of, and those immediately get added to the list.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
excellent, great. So this kind of a big picture question, but where do students get stuck? Ann Bauer wants to know. What part is most challenging? And I think like you and I have reflected on this quite a bit over the past semester. And so there might be several things like, because there's different types of stuck
Yeah.
and different types of challenging, I think, especially in a curriculum like this.
Yeah, I think one big space of stuck is why are we doing this and why are we doing it in ecology, right? Like why are we talking about race? Why are we talking about gender? Why are we talking about disability? And why are we doing it in an ecology class? And I address that a lot by thinking through the harms that we've caused when we silo. Um, and the hope that could come when we break these silos. I think another space of stuck is just actually, you know what? Forgive me constantly like skipping slides, but let me just have students tell you where they get stuck. Students say, and these are again representative comments, right? That it asks them not just to think about how things happen, but why things happen. That is challenging, but that is a challenge that they value. This is students responding to how did the course stretch your thinking and how would you describe it or these projects to a student. They also describe a challenge being the non-linear process, right? But again, that messiness is something that I intentionally want students to engage in through the cure. And then lack of specified direction. Again, these are challenges. And we need to scaffold and think carefully and intentionally about bringing students into that process.
Excellent. So what could you reflect on? I know we've talked a little bit about this, so this is just my own. So we have like you have a lot of ULAs, right, in class, and you're going to be having like TAs next semester too. So how have you thought about like what kind of support, teaching, reflection a new person who is teaching a course like this would have to think about, or a project like this?
Yeah. So as we think through the particular challenges that go with this, right, there's some new challenges, and then there's some challenges that just always exist regardless, right? And so as I think through like all of like class is an ecosystem, right? My learning environment is an ecosystem. That's the way I think about it. And so I think about how every change that I make or every change that does happen impacts everything else. So as I think through these things, I want my students to think critically. And what I mean by critically is if we're placing ecology within this societal context that has history and that has racism and sexism and oppression as inherent, then that also exists in my class, right? And so we do a lot of work with groups and with our class, unpacking the ways that race shows up within our learning space, unpacking the ways that gender or disability show up. And I think in speaking with my TAs who will be with me in fall, that is scary. Holding those discussions is scary. It is intimidating. And so I have a lot of detailed lesson plans that I'm constructing. I gave you a very quick overview of the instructions that I give ULAs, right? That is the summarized little printed thing that they get in class. In addition to that, there's a long lesson plan that we go over every week, right? So I really want them to feel confident in that space. And I really want them to feel okay with not being perfect in that space as well, both of those things.
Yeah. Teresa wanted to follow up about the teaching team. And I think that there's the teaching team, but then there's the people who you developed the curriculum with. And those are two separate groups of people, right? And so Teresa wants to know, like, to what degree does this type of course has to be team taught? And I guess not, because you're doing it by yourself. But like, how did you find your colleagues in sociology to help you kind of construct, help you find these databases on redlining and help you connect these things to the ecology that's inequitable?
Um, that is a good question. It's a challenging question to answer because it's just I go to a lot of spaces where people who are more entrenched in this work and who are smarter and more thoughtful with me are doing this work. And then I just ask them a lot of questions. And then sometimes they're like, hey, you have a lot of questions. I maybe can help you. It's a lot of informal, just going to as many different spaces as you can. And being intentional in recognizing that there are limits to our own training and disciplinary knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is something new for you, right? This year. Like you've been teaching
Yeah,
intro bio ecology
for a long
cures for a
time.
while. Yeah, for a
Yeah.
long time.
And I've been wanting students to do this work and repeatedly, the first thing that I did, for example, was add in the Shell et al. Article, right? Then I was like, and then this will fix it. And of course it didn't fix it. Like reading an article does nothing, right? It only made them use words like heat islands or something like that, but not do so intentionally and with thoughtfulness. It wasn't a true integration. I wasn't teaching it as a true integration. So why would I expect students to learn that?
Yeah. And so let's just take the last minutes to answer the hardest question here by Savannah. So Savannah's state recently denounced the use of DEI concepts in university classrooms. Have you dealt with this issue? And do you have an advice for navigating teaching about equity when you're in a tumultuous political landscape?
Yeah, I really, really feel for you. I'm in so many different communities and colleagues where we're just spending all of our time coming up with alternative words.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
right?
Aaron replies, you can rebrand as belonging.
Yeah, yeah. So there are things you can do, but it takes a toll on you and students. I just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that is all the questions. So thank you very much, Shahnaz. This was a great experience. And I will always I've always was inspired by George's presentations at ESA and George and Charles's presentations about the Crosstown Walk. And so I was so excited to hear about your curriculum, which is basically an enaction of the Crosstown Walk as a semester long project. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. So right now,